In this presentation, we'll define some basic terminology, but also complicate those terms because it turns out that sex and gender are more complicated than you might expect. If you've not done so yet, please read the National Geographic article titled Rethinking Gender and review the Genderbread Person PDF. This presentation will also introduce you to Bem's theory of gender schemas, focusing on her sex role inventory. We sometimes use the terms sex and gender interchangeably, but technically they refer to two different ideas. The term sex differentiates people based on biological traits. When you were born and the doctor exclaimed, "It's a girl," or "It's a boy," they were referring to your sex. We tend to think of sex as binary. You can be female or male. Those are the terms we use to describe someone's sex. This may explain why doctors refer to their patients as males and females. They specialize in human biology. The biological factors that we use to categorize sex include hormones, chromosomes, reproductive organs, genitalia, and secondary sex characteristics. Let's consider each of these. When it comes to chromosomes, you may know that females have XX chromosomes and males have XY chromosomes. If you've read the National Geographic article, you'll also know that there are several other possibilities, including XXY chromosomes. This is where sex starts getting a bit more complicated than just female or male. When it comes to hormones, some people have a lot of testosterone in their bodies, which is a male-linked hormone, and some people have a lot of estrogen, a female-linked hormone. But these hormones don't always match up with what we would expect based on chromosomes. Some people with XX chromosomes have a lot of testosterone and vice versa. So again, sex may not be as black and white as you would expect. When we're talking about sex organs, both the internal and external ones, there are more than just two possibilities. Make sure you've read the Rethinking Gender article for detailed examples. If we just consider the basics though, sex organs develop in the womb. A fetus starts as sex neutral with a genital ridge. All sex organs come from that same genital ridge. The cells that become testes in males are the same cells that become labia and ovaries in females. And the cells that become a penis in males are the same that become a clitoris in females. But these sex organs do not always develop in perfect harmony, and sometimes a person will have a clitoris but no ovaries, for example. Finally, secondary sex characteristics are the ones that show up at puberty. These include things like body hair and facial hair, breasts, and even changes to your skeletal system like shoulders and hips. Some people with otherwise female biology do not develop obvious breasts or a large waist to hip ratio. Some people with otherwise male biology never grow much or any facial hair or get very tall or develop a very deep voice. All of these are biological characteristics. Hopefully, these examples have given you a sense that sex, based in biology, is not a simple binary. Most people do fit tidily into either a biological female or biological male category, but there's a lot of variation within the categories, and there's even people who don't fit clearly into either category. Let's explore a visualization of this on the next slide. Sex, which is based in biology, exists on a continuum. A continuum is a continuous sequence in which adjacent elements are not perceptibly different from one another, but the extremes are extremely distinct. This very technical definition is easier to understand when you see it visually, so let's explore the sex continuum drawn here. All the way on the right, we might have a person with XY chromosomes with high levels of testosterone, low levels of estrogen, and testes that regularly create a lot of sperm, a full-size penis, a lot of body hair and facial hair, and broad shoulders, who's 6 feet tall with a deep voice, and so on and so on. We've got someone who is obviously, clearly, biologically male. If we move a tiny bit further left, we have males who may not meet all of those characteristics, but we still consider biologically male. Maybe they can't grow a full beard, or they have a slightly higher voice, or moderate levels of estrogen, or whatever. As we move further left, we eventually reach a gray area in the middle. We might have people with XXY chromosomes, or XYY, or XXX, or genitalia which did not clearly develop into a penis or a clitoris, but something in between, like clitoromegaly, which is also known as a pseudopenis. Or they might not have functioning internal sex organs, or hopefully you get the general idea here. There's lots of ways that someone might not clearly fall into one category or the other. So we use the word intersex to describe people who are neither clearly male nor clearly female. Current research estimates that intersex people make up about 1.7% of the population, which makes being intersex about as common as having red hair. It's not super common, but it happens all the time. So although we often talk about sex as a binary, that is something with just two options. There are objectively at least three options: male, female, and intersex. But really, the most accurate way to define sex is on a continuum, with people filling in every possible space from one side to the other. Most people fall on one side or the other, which is what the image means by bimodal. There are two modes, or peaks, in the graph. But of course, there are people between the peaks and on either side. So to summarize, sex is based in biology, and although sex exists on a continuum, we typically categorize individuals as male, female, or intersex. Now let's move on to gender. Unlike sex, gender is entirely created by people and our cultures. Gender is what society expects from males and females. If sex differentiates between female and male, gender differentiates between feminine and masculine. We expect females to be feminine and males to be masculine. So what do we consider to be masculine? In our culture, it's usually being tough, competitive, aggressive. On the other hand, femininity is associated with being sweet, cooperative, caring. Let's be clear, though, these expectations come from our culture. We typically expect women to have longer hair and men to have shorter hair. But why? There's no biological difference between how long men and women can grow their hair. And historically, there were periods of time, even in Western societies, where the most masculine men had long hair. So this expectation is based on culture, not biology. Because our society defines gender, we call gender a social construct. In other words, gender is socially constructed. Our society creates or constructs an idea of what is true and what is good. We will explore the theory of social construction in more detail later on. For today, we'll simply say that gender is not something we're born with, like sex. Instead, gender is how we were raised. Male children, boys, are taught to be masculine, and female children, girls, are taught to be feminine. What about intersex children? The parents usually pick a gender and they'll raise the child as one or the other. Like with biological sex, people tend to talk about gender like it's a binary. There are feminine people and there are masculine people. Sandra Bem, a sociologist, developed the sex roles inventory to measure gender in the 1970s. She had items that measured traits typically associated with women and femininity, and traits typically associated with men and masculinity. Let's pause for a moment and consider Bem's approach or paradigm. She created a long list of characteristics and asked participants to rate themselves along them. I've included some examples here. She's taking an abstract concept, the social construct of gender, and measuring it, quantifying it. Based on this research method, what paradigm do you think Bem uses? All right, let's get back to the concepts here. Take a look at the actual items in Bem's questionnaire. I'm willing to bet that you can figure out which items measure masculinity and which ones measure femininity. A common criticism of Bem's survey is that it's dated. I mean, the survey was published in 1974. Surely our expectations for men and women have changed. And indeed, there is an updated version of this survey. I've included a link to it in our module. You can complete it if you want. But the original version is still pretty relevant. You probably won't be surprised that characteristics like warm and compassionate measure femininity, while independent and assertive measure masculinity. I think these gender roles still apply today. But then again, you might be thinking, well, I'm both warm and assertive. And that's where the binary of masculine versus feminine really breaks down. The word binary essentially means either or. So if I ask, are you an American citizen? There are really only two options, yes or no. This is a binary. You're either an American citizen or you're not. There's no middle ground. We've already explored how this is not the case for biological sex. A person's sex can be female, male, or intersex. Well, we're going to see that gender also cannot be expressed as a binary. Some people are more feminine than masculine, and some people are more masculine than feminine, but plenty of people are both masculine and feminine, what we call androgynous. You can see this idea reflected in the Rethinking Gender article, and I've reproduced their gender continuum on this slide. This idea of a gender continuum ranging from feminine to masculine with androgynous in the middle was already popular among academics when Sandra Bem was conducting her research. But she did not think that this continuum reflected reality very well. She believed that femininity and masculinity did not belong on the same continuum. Let's look at Bem's theory on the next slide. When Bem used her survey to measure gender, she found that people who scored high in masculinity did not necessarily score low in femininity, and vice versa. So some people were masculine and feminine, and some people were neither masculine nor feminine. In social science, we see this often when we measure two separate variables. So that was Bem's conclusion here. Masculinity and femininity are two independent variables. By the way, this should be cueing you into what Bem's paradigm is. If not, go back and listen to that last sentence again. To reiterate, you can be feminine and also masculine. You can be neither feminine nor masculine. Gender is not defined according to a single continuum, but rather two continua. You can see them at the bottom here, and you can even draw yourself where you feel you might fit. Are you feminine? A little bit? A lot? Somewhere in the middle? What about masculine? A little? A lot? Bem named 4 specific combinations, which you can see on the next slide. A person who is high on femininity but low on masculinity will be feminine. And conversely, someone who's high on masculinity but low on femininity is masculine. But someone who's high on both is androgynous. They are compassionate and act as a leader. They are ambitious and gentle. Bem believed that both masculinity and femininity were good things, really. There were benefits to both. So actually, for her, the ideal gender would be someone who's both masculine and feminine, someone who's androgynous. It's also possible to score low on both. Bem called this undifferentiated. This kind of person does not comply to either set of gender expectations. Although Bem came up with category names for these particular combinations, people can fit anywhere along both dimensions. Those stars can slide anywhere along those lines, and any combination is possible. Much like sex, gender is not binary. But instead of existing on a single continuum, gender is defined along two continua. Note that the plural of continuum is continua or continuums. I've been using the word continua for over a decade now, so that's the one I'm going to keep using, but both are technically correct. In summary, we've evolved from a very basic concept of sex and gender as binaries to defining them on a single continuum and then defining gender along two continua. But we're not done yet because gender is still kind of vague. It's a set of expectations, okay, but is it for how we behave, how you feel deep inside, how you interact with others? For Bem, the answer was yes, yes, and yes. But as we better understood the complexity of gender, we ended up defining more specific aspects of gender to be able to talk about them better. You'll notice that the National Geographic article identifies 3 concepts: gender identity, biological sex, and gender expression. Let's start with those 3, but we're going to be using the genderbread person to illustrate the terms. First, let's point out that the genderbread person defines biological sex along 2 continua, like gender. For our purposes in this class, this complexity is not necessary. we're just not going to be talking that much about biology, and so we're not going to be talking that much about sex. So even though, yes, we can define sex along two continua, we're just going to talk about this variable as though it's categorical. In other words, people fall into three categories when it comes to sex: intersex, female, and male. Is reality more complicated than that? Yeah, absolutely. Does it matter in a gender and communication course? No, it does not. So let's move on to gender and the differentiation between gender identity and gender expression. Your gender identity is who you feel you are. There is still debate about whether this is something we choose or something you're born with, but at the end of the day, what's most relevant when studying communication is that gender identity comes from inside you. It's not how other people label you or their expectations for you. It's about who you believe you are, and the foremost expert on you is you. Colloquially, we say that gender identity exists on a spectrum. More precisely, though, gender identity is defined along two continua: how much you identify as a woman and how much you identify as a man. The genderbread person labels these as manness and womanness. There are an infinity of possible combinations and dozens of labels that people use. The simplest two are man and woman, or boy and girl. But there are plenty more, like agender, genderqueer, non-binary, and so on. All of these are answers to the question, what is your gender identity? Your identity, who you feel you are, will shape how you communicate with others. Let's clarify the relationship between biological sex and gender identity. These are two separate concepts, and they vary independently. In other words, your biological sex does not determine your gender identity. Someone who was born with clearly male or female biology and who identifies with a corresponding gender identity is called cis. For example, if you were born female with female biology and you identify as a woman, then we say you're a cis woman. On the other hand, when someone's identity does not correspond with their biology, particularly their sex assigned at birth, then we call them trans. So a trans man is someone whose biology is not predominantly male, or at least was not predominantly male at birth, but who identifies as a man. Similarly, a trans woman was not born as a biological female, but identifies as a woman. Even though most people are cis, that is, most biological females identify as women and most biological males identify as men, plenty of people are trans, so we cannot say that sex determines gender identity. Let's move on to gender expression, which is how people express themselves to others. This aspect of gender is all about communication. If identity is how you feel inside, expression is what you show outside. This includes how we dress, the haircuts we get, whether or not we wear makeup. This also includes the words we choose to use, like, "that's so cute," or "bro," as well as the way we speak. Things like uptalk, when you finish your sentences with a higher pitch, like this, tend to be associated with femininity, at least in our culture, at least at this point in time. Speaking more monotone with less variation in pitch is associated with masculinity. So gender expression is something we're always doing when we're around others, often without realizing it. The labels here are basically unhelpful. Gender expression varies so much from person to person that trying to categorize people into discrete groups is nearly impossible. Plus, how you define your gender expression might be linked to your gender identity. So one of the examples here is butch. This probably describes a person who identifies as a woman and who presents herself in more masculine ways. A man who expresses himself in similarly masculine ways is less likely to self-describe as butch. He's more likely to just say he's masculine. So the labels here are really not important. Don't get hung up on them. What's more important to understand here is that gender expression varies a lot. Some people are very masculine and a little bit feminine. Some people are very feminine and not at all masculine. Some people are neither masculine nor feminine. Some people are a little bit of both. Every combination is possible. Again, gender expression is not determined by biological sex. It's not even determined by gender identity. Plenty of women express themselves in masculine ways and plenty of men express themselves in feminine ways. Gender expression is defined according to societal expectations and personal preferences, not biology or identity alone. At the end of the day, what I hope you're getting from this is, first, gender is complex and multifaceted. Second, we typically define gender along two continua, though biological sex can be simplified and defined according to three categories. And finally, these concepts vary independently. You can be a biological male, identify as a woman, and express yourself in both masculine and feminine ways. You can be intersex, that's biological sex, a man, that's gender identity, and androgynous, that's gender expression. Any combination is possible. Now that we've broken down the difference between sex and gender, let's take a look at the last component of the genderbread person, sexual orientation. If gender was complex, sexual orientation is a real can of worms, and honestly, trying to decipher all the intricacies is not that important for the purposes of a gender and communication class. Here are the three things we should be clear on. 1. Sexual orientation is based on both romantic attraction and sexual attraction. Yes, these are two different things. If you've ever played the game Fuck, Marry, Kill, you've gotten a sense of this. There's a difference between the person you would just want to fuck and the person you want to marry. That's the difference between sexual and romantic attraction. Ideally, if we choose to form a committed romantic relationship with someone, we're both sexually and romantically attracted to that person, but these two attractions don't always happen at the same time with the same person. 2. Both these components of sexual orientation are also defined along two dimensions. You can be attracted to males, men, and masculinity, and also to females, women, and femininity. You can be attracted to one and not the other. You can be attracted to both, but one more than the other. You can be romantically attracted to one group, but sexually attracted to both. And let's not forget that you can also be attracted to neither. Some people are asexual, sometimes nicknamed ace. These folks are not sexually attracted to anyone, and some people are aromantic, aro for short. They are not romantically attracted to anyone. And some people are both asexual and aromantic. It's not super common, but it definitely happens. I think the Netflix show BoJack Horseman did a pretty good job of depicting asexuality and some of its nuances. The character Todd is asexual, but not aromantic. In his case, he's sexually attracted to neither men nor women, neither masculinity nor femininity, neither males nor females. However, he is romantically attracted to women and femininity. And that's more or less number 3. All combinations are possible. People can be straight or gay, they can be bisexual or pansexual or asexual. Sexual and romantic attraction are independent, so you can kind of have different scores for the two categories, and sexual orientation overall is independent from gender identity and expression, which is also independent from sex. We've defined many terms here that we will be using throughout the semester: sex, gender, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, and sexual and romantic attraction. We've also covered concepts like intersex, cis, and androgynous. The idea that bears repeating here is that all of these concepts do not determine one another. Someone's biological sex does not determine their gender identity or expression. Someone's gender expression does not determine their sexual orientation. Someone's sexual attraction does not determine their romantic attraction. So what do you think? Where do you fit along these continua? What labels ring most true to you? And how much choice do you believe you have in any of these gender-related variables?